First, that was the previous president. Middle Eastern. I didn't bring it. The Middle Eastern.
The subject today is institutions, a subject that requires us to go far beyond economics, even if economics is only the first floor of it. And here is the itinerary that I propose to walk. So first, institutions in economic theory. That is to say, in the economic theory that resulted from the marginalist turn at the end of the 19th century. Second, the classical theory of structures or regimes. When I say classical, I mean the theory in classical European social theory. Yes?
Do you mind just turning the mic on? I don't think it's on.
Is the microphone on? Thank you. So, first, as I was saying, institutions in economics. In the economics that resulted from the marginalist turn at the end of the 19th century. Second, the basis for a better approach to economic institutions and institutional change in the economy in a theory of regimes. So first we have to ask, what was the theory of regimes in classical European social theory, and in particular in its consummate expression, Marx's theory of society and history. And of course the defects of this view. Third, then, the outline of an alternative view of structures and structural change, alternative to this view that was established in Marx's theory. I'm going to call it a proto-theory. Then, fourth, the emphasis on a particular feature of this proto-theory, which is the extent to which institutional arrangements can help organize or promote experimentalism, and why this experimentalist turn has special significance for us today. And then fifth, a brief exploration of the two large conditions or directions that encourage experimentalism. An experimentalist culture and a high-energy democracy. Precisely the same two conditions that I highlighted in class 2 weeks ago as underpinning the path to an inclusive form of the knowledge economy. And then finally, the translation of this alternative view of institutions and institutional change into an approach to the question of agency. That is, how do these programmatic ideas about alternatives meet up with the real world of social interests and social forces? So first then, institutions in economic theory. You could say that in the economics that results from the marginalist turn, what has been ever since mainstream economics, there are three main approaches to institutions. The first is the approach taken in pure economics. By pure economics, I mean the pure marginalist theory of economics, the theory of allocational efficiency, the economy viewed as a connected set of markets, in principle, as an ideal limit, perfectly competitive markets. Now, in pure economics, there are no institutional assumptions or commitments. If this economics is pursued and practiced rigorously, it will make no institutional assumptions. This is the economics that in the middle of the 20th century took the form of general equilibrium analysis and pure theories of choice. It was established in the middle of the 20th century in the debate about the question of socialism and its status in economics that the pure apparatus of marginalist economics could apply equally to any institutional system, including to a command economy. It had no institutional commitments of any kind. So pure economics is innocent of institutional affinities, but by the same token, it is impotent in its ability to support particular institutional directions. This is economics as pure logic, which at its heart, marginalist economic theory was much more a form of logic than a causal theory. The second approach to institutions in economics was what you could call fundamentalist economics. And early in the course, I gave as an extreme example of this fundamental economics, Hayek's theory. Fundamentalist economics makes two crucial identifications. First, it identifies allocational efficiency with the market order. And second, and more momentously, it identifies the abstract conception of the market with a very concrete set of legal and institutional arrangements, including the forms of contract, of property, and of corporate association that evolved in the course of modern Western history. So when this economics speaks of the market, it means that market. And this is, of course, an idea pregnant with many practical and ideological consequences. It is an idea that contradicts what you could regard as the single greatest analytical achievement of legal theory in the period from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century. The cumulative vindication of the thesis that a market order has no single natural and necessary institutional form, that there is no determinate set of legal rules or doctrines that expresses its nature. So this is what the 19th century jurists began to discover, often against their initial intentions. They set out to demonstrate that from the abstract idea of a market, from the idea of economic decentralization, you could infer by successive degrees of concreteness a whole detailed set of rules about contract, about property, and about the contract corporate form. And they ended up demonstrating the opposite, as I say, against their original intentions. You could go down the ladder of concreteness, and at each rung of that ladder toward greater concreteness, you would face choices about whether the abstract conception of freedom of contract or private property, for example, could be developed in one direction or another. And it turned out that the choice of directions always depended on the position you took in some particular conflict of interests and visions. You could not infer the answer to the question by going back to the abstract conception of economic freedom. So that's fundamentalist economics. Now, there is a third approach to economics that has emerged in the course of the history of post-marginalist economic theory, and let me call it polemically equivocating economics. And it is exemplified by the approach to macroeconomics, to the Keynesian or post-Keynesian macroeconomics that prevails, especially in the research departments of the leading American departments of economics. The attempt of what I'm calling equivocating economics is to establish law-like economic regularities among large-scale economic aggregates, such as the level of investment, of savings, and of employment. Characteristic example is the so-called Phillips curve, which claimed to establish an inverse relation between the level of unemployment and the level of inflation, and was regarded then later as discredited by the stagflation of the 1970s. So it claims that there are these law-like relations between these large-scale economic aggregates against a shadowy institutional background. So when I say a shadowy institutional background, it is a very detailed set of institutional arrangements that are assumed. For example, in the case of the Phillips curve, whether labor is organized or not, whether it's organized in a particular way by collective bargaining, for example, whether there's unemployment insurance and so forth. And all of these details will have an influence on the so-called law-like regularities. So what happens is that if these institutional arrangements are in fact largely stagnant, as they were in this historical period in the late 20th century, it will be easy to mistake their stability for a law-like character. Stagnation will be read as lawfulness in a scientific sense. And then if you challenge them, if you challenge one of these equivocating economists and say, but if you change this or that in the institutional background, if you change the way in which the workers are organized, or the extent to which there's unemployment insurance, or the kind of power that the state exercises in monetary policy after the gold standard was abandoned, then this law-like regularity will also shift, as in fact it did shift in the case of my example of the Phillips curve. So when the equivocating economist is faced with this challenge, his tendency will be what the lawyers call confession and demur. He will say, yes, that's true. If this or that change, my stability, my supposed law-like stability will in fact be threatened. But then, if in fact there is no instability as a matter of contingent fact, he'll go back to his argument. That is, in his analytic and argumentative practice, he will deny the weight of the concession that he just made. And that's what I mean by equivocating economics. So what the combination of these three approaches, of pure economics, of fundamentalist economics, and of equivocating economics, suggests to us is that there is no good way of approaching economic institutions in this tradition of economic theory. And that's the reason why we have to retreat beyond the boundaries of economic theory to a larger view of regimes and regime change in order to understand our theme today. But before doing that, let me stop and ask for your comment or questions about this idea, which I've just summarized in the critique of these three approaches to institutions in economic theory. All right, so we've seen that this theoretical tradition has trouble with the theme of institutions. And so the next question is, the second step in my itinerary, where can we look for a theory of institutions if we must look beyond economics, or at least beyond this mainstream tradition of economics? And the answer is classical European social theory, and especially its most systematic treatment of the problem of regimes and regime change, Marxist theory of society and history. At the center of this classical social theoretical view of regimes and regime change, structures, and how to talk about them, how to think about them, how to understand their transformation, is a central insight. The central insight is that the structures of society are artifacts which we made. They are our creation. They're not natural. They're not part of the furniture of the universe. And because we made them, as Vico had already suggested at the end of the 18th century, we can hope to understand them in the more intimate way in which a creator understands his creation, rather than in the external way in which we understand, for example, the atomic structure of a natural object. So we could radicalize this insight into the artifactual character of the regimes or structures of social life by saying that they're a kind of frozen fighting. So there's an ongoing practical and visionary struggle in history over the terms of our relations to one another. And this struggle is from time to time interrupted or contained. Temporarily interrupted and partially contained. And then the structures, the rigidified institutional arrangements and their legal expression, are then the residue of these moments of relative containment and temporary interruption. And that's why you could say, speaking metaphorically, that we could think of them as frozen fighting. Now, to change the metaphor, imagine the following. A game of musical chairs. And the music is the conflict. Our conflict with one another over the terms of social life. And when the music stops, everyone sits down on the chairs. The chairs are then the structures. It's the same kind of idea, that there's the solid and the liquid form of social life. The solid form are these structures, and the liquid form is ongoing conflict over the structures, over their design and reconstruction. That's the basic, the central insight in the classical theory of structures, which distinguish the modern view, as we have it in Marx, from the classical theories of regimes from Aristotle to Montesquieu. Now, Marx called these structures or systems modes of production. The slave economy, feudalism, capitalism, and then socialism. And his central idea about the nature of these structures, the central revolutionary insight which I just described, they're frozen fighting. They're what results from the stopping or interruption of the music in the game of musical chairs. This central insight was compromised and to some extent eviscerated by a series of assumptions. And let me call them then the assumptions or the illusions of false necessity. So the first illusion was the illusion that there is a closed list of alternative regimes, in world history. And they're, in Marxist theory, the modes of production. They come one after another. And we don't get to choose the list. The list is provided by history. The second assumption is the indivisibility assumption. Each of these regimes is an indivisible system. All of its parts stand or fall together. From this indivisibility idea, there results a practical consequence of enormous significance, which is the binary idea of politics. Politics is of two types: the revolutionary substitution of one system for another, or the reformist management of a system. And what that excludes, of course, is that the change in the regime, in the structure, could be piecemeal, fragmentary, as I believe it in fact almost always is. So in fact, this idea of total systemic change is a somewhat fantastical limiting case. And it is a limiting case of what you could regard as the paradigmatic form of structural change, which is fragmentary, piecemeal, but potentially cumulative and decisive in its effects persisting over time. The third illusion is the illusion of historical laws, that there are laws governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible systems in history. Those are the three illusions of false necessity, which I'm arguing compromise the validity and eviscerate to some extent the content of the central revolutionary insight into the artifactual character of the structures. And the result of the discrediting of these illusions by historical learning and by political practice is that the theory itself has become very hard to believe in. This, of course, has immense significance for the left because Marx's theory of structures and structural theory, structural change, has been the single greatest intellectual influence on the ideas of the left. So the result is that people speak the vocabulary of this theory, capitalism, class conflict, and so forth, but they rarely believe in the theoretical assumptions that give meaning to this vocabulary. And the result is an enormous confusion. So that's the problem with which we're left by the classical theory of structures. On the other hand, in the contemporary social sciences, as for example they're practiced in the American universities, the illusions of false necessity are cast aside, but only because structural vision altogether is suppressed. So the predominant tendency of the positive social sciences, economics first among them, is the naturalization or rationalization of the existing arrangements, perceived as being the outcome of a kind of evolutionary funnel that results in the discovery and emergence of the best institutions and the best practices. This resembles what in the history of philosophy we call right-wing Hegelianism. The real is rational. And it results in a confusion of explanation with retrospective mystification or rationalization. And that is what a large part of the content of this positive social science has become. Then in the normative disciplines of political philosophy, as in the theories of justice, or legal theory, the elucidation of law as a system of impersonal principles of right and policies responsive to the collective interest, what we have are a series of pseudo-philosophical props to the ameliorative practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy, or the idealization of law as an approximation to an idealized system of policies and principles. So the structure is accepted implicitly, but it is to be idealized or humanized by these activities, and the analytic exercise consists in finding the right set of ideas that can result in this conclusion. So what's characteristically the case then is that in these fields, the thinkers mainly all agree on the bottom line. The bottom line is some kind of liberal social democracy. They only disagree about the top line. From what set of ideas or in what vocabulary are they to deduce this conclusion on which they've already agreed? And then the third tendency is you find in the humanities, which then embark on a roller coaster of subjectivist adventurism, detached from any attempt to imagine the reorganization of society. So it's an escapism. So we have rationalization, humanization, and escapism. The defenders of these three tendencies pretend to be enemies, but in fact they're allies in the work of disarming the transformative will and the transformative imagination. That's where we're left by this intellectual history, which I've just summarized in a few minutes, in which we have, on the one side, a theory of structure, like Marx's, which has become unusable and unbelievable, and on the other hand, a suppression of any ability to understand structure and structural change or structural discontinuity. And all of that helps put in perspective the dilemma, the rhetorical dilemma that I pointed out to you in the first class in this course. When I said, I propose something that's close to what exists, you say that's feasible, but it's trivial. I propose something distant from what exists, you say that's interesting, but it's utopian, and everything that can be discussed seems to be either trivial or utopian. Confusing then, programmatic thought is a succession of steps with the definition of blueprints. But the intellectual basis of this false dilemma is our inability to understand how structural change happens, to have a way of talking about structure. And as a result, we fall back on this fake criterion of political realism, that a proposal is realistic if it's close to what already exists, which of course isn't an account of political realism at all. It's just a confession of intellectual failure. Well, there's a lot in those few moments there of my account of structure and the history of structure. Let me ask again whether you have comments on this before I go to the next step. So the next, yes, were you going to say something? Yes.
Could you talk a little more about the difference between reformism under the
Reformism, yes. So
and the fragmentary kind of change?
well, I'm going to come to that in this proto-theory, but let me anticipate some of that. So a direct implication of what I call the indivisibility thesis, the thesis that these structures are indivisible systems, is that politics must either be revolutionary or reformist. Right? Either it's the management of, for example, so-called capitalism, it's the management of capitalism, or it's its replacement by another system, socialism. And what's denied then is that institutional change, change in the basic institutional arrangements and the ideological assumptions with which they're connected, could be piecemeal. It could be part by part, fragmentary. But in fact, it almost always is fragmentary to the extent that it happens. That's what institutional change, I want to argue, largely consists of. So that's the issue that's in discussion there. So let's take an example. Keynesianism, understood now not just as a set of theoretical ideas in economics, but as a set of practical policies that authorize the state to break with the gold standard and to use fiscal and monetary policy countercyclically to restabilize the economy, to smooth out the periods of recession and so forth. That's an example of a radical reform, of a piecemeal structural change, which gave shape to the present form of the business cycle, or the political economic business cycle, as it's sometimes now called. So it has fateful consequences. It has decisive consequences. And you could say, well, it's still capitalism. It hasn't replaced capitalism. But it is a partial structural change. Now, I want to argue that structural change in history is primarily like that. That's what it's like. And if structural change continue in a certain direction, or if they accumulate in a certain way, they may seem after a while to have, quote, revolutionary consequences. But now I recur to another idea that I mentioned in an earlier moment in the course, which is the way in which the idea of revolution today, of the revolutionary substitution of one system for another, has become to a large extent an alibi for its opposite. So many countries in the world now are governed by ex-Marxists who have become disillusioned, institutionally conservative social democrats. And the way they think is this: real change would be the substitution of capitalism by socialism, even though no one knows for sure what socialism means today. But that's not in the cards, that change. It's not on the horizon. If it were on the horizon, it would be too dangerous to even try it. So what's left to do is to humanize the world. For example, through compensatory redistribution, by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. So in this way, the idea of revolution is turned on its head and becomes part of the justification for its opposite, which is reformism, in that binary approach to the idea of politics, to the politics of transformation. So it's clear that what is difficult and confusing then is that we have no usable way of thinking or talking about structures, structural change, and structural discontinuity. The central object of ambition in social thought is the theory of regimes. And so that's what I want to come to next. That's my third step in this itinerary. So I can't hope here to propose or defend an alternative theory of regimes, but I want to provide the broad outlines of what you could call a proto-theory, because it's an important element in the arguments we have been having and will have about vanguard and rearguard, labor and capital, finance and the real economy. The assumptions about structure are crucial. Now, first of all, What is then the general idea of a structure or a regime? The idea is that it is the fundamental set of institutional arrangements and of ideological representations that shape the routine activities and conflicts in society. And especially those conflicts that have to do with the creation of the future within the present. So conflicts over the use of economic capital, of political power, and of cultural authority, by which in the present we make the future. So the idea is that these surface conflicts in society rest on an underlying architecture of arrangements and assumptions. The institutional arrangements are never just like things. After all, there are creations, we made them. They have to be represented in ideas and in discourse for us to operate them. So we have a picture in our minds of what relations among people can and should look like in the different parts of social life. These are the ideological representations that are, as it were, the reverse side of the institutional arrangements. And every structure, every regime has this dual nature, as Aristotle and Montesquieu already understood, even before the problem of transformation became central. They must exist as arrangements, but they must exist also as consciousness. They must be represented in a discourse in the world of ideas. Now, in these structures, the different elements reinforce one another, to be sure. But they're not systems, and therefore these structures aren't indivisible. And that's then the basis for the rejection of the binary idea of politics. When they change, they change characteristically in a fragmentary but potentially cumulative fashion. And if they continue changing in a certain direction under the aegis of a certain conception, we could describe the change later as revolutionary. But that's not how they characteristically begin. Now, a second feature of these structures that has to do with their relation to functional imperatives in social life. So, how are these structures made, or how are they remade? They result from a choice of what's available in the historical circumstance. And it's not as if we were picking options out from some shelf that has the total menu of alternatives in history. There's a competition among regimes in which we choose on the basis of the present experience, of the immediate candidates, of the rivals, what seems to be needed, what seems to work best. The same functional imperative, the same level of prosperity or military power can characteristically have alternative institutional bases. Contrary to what Marx's theory implies, there's no one-to-one relation between functional characteristics or consequences and institutional conditions. The same level of economic and technological development, for example, can be based on alternative sets of institutional arrangements. Nevertheless, one institutional arrangement can be much more successful than another in exploiting the potential of an innovation, whether it's a conceptual, technological, organizational innovation. And this leads to the discussion of the concept of the path of least resistance, which I introduced at earlier moments in the course. So the tendency is for an innovation to be adapted in the form that least disturbs the ruling interest and the established preconceptions. And that's what I'm calling the path of least resistance. The insular knowledge economy, which is what we have today as the form of the knowledge economy, the knowledge economy that's a set of fringes that exclude the vast majority of workers and of firms, is a characteristic example of the path of least resistance. It adapts the institutional forms and technologies of the knowledge economy in the form that's least disturbing to the ruling interest and established preconceptions. After all, the knowledge economy emerged in class societies with steep inequalities, and then adapted in this form, it contributed further to the aggravation of these inequalities, as we have seen. So that's a second characteristic that this proto-theory of regimes and regime change has to take account of. Now here's a third characteristic. And this is the third characteristic which I most want to emphasize in the subsequent discussion today. An institutional structure, or an institutional and ideological structure, a regime, a framework, does not exist in the same way in which a natural object exists. It does not have an invariant existence. It exists more or less. It can be more or less entrenched against transformation. The more entrenched against transformation it is, the more we can say it becomes as if it were a thing, as if it were part of the furniture universe, of the universe. It is reified, it assumes a thing-like character. So, by definition, a structure resists transformation to some degree. And that's how we know it's a structure. So we know that there's been a structural change when something has changed in these routines of conflict over our creation of the future within the present. But the extent to which these structures determine their own sequel, that is, the extent of path dependency, is not a constant, it's a variable. The structures can be organized to encourage or discourage their own transformation. They can be organized to promote their own revision in the light of experience. And in that sense, they become less entrenched and less thing-like. So let me first state this idea in a very abstract and general form. Imagine that we have then two categories of moves, of activities. There are the ordinary moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted and leave unchallenged and unchanged. And there are the extraordinary moves by which, from time to time, typically under the provocation of some crisis, like war or economic collapse, we challenge and change parts of this framework. So there are the routine moves, and then there are these radical transformations. The relation between these two sets of moves, the routine ones and the non-routine ones, is what is variable. And that's what has to do with this variable character of path dependency or entrenchment. So we can narrow the distance or aggravate the distance The moves by which we transform parts of the framework of arrangements and assumptions can grow more naturally and continuously out of the ordinary business of life, or not. And we could say that the more we narrow this distance, the more empowered we are. So it's a way of saying that we create a structure which facilitates its own transformation. It helps disentrench itself. It lends itself to transformation, and as a result of that, it diminishes the dependence of change on crisis. So the more a structure is disentrenched, the less we need some exogenous shock, like a war or an economic collapse, to make transformation possible. Now, I want to say that this variation that exists in history and in the nature of regimes is of a special significance to us today. Because I've argued that, like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to emphasize structural over non-structural change. That's what I'm trying to argue in dealing with vanguards and rearguards, labor and capital, finance and the real economy. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to resist entrusting our future to dogmatic institutional blueprints. And therefore we have a problem without historical precedent, which is how we can cultivate structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. Because of this fact, the experimentalist character of structures, their ability to disentrench themselves, to relativize the weight of path dependence, gains special significance. That's the argument I'm making. And that then leads to the subsequent discussion that I want to have in this fourth step of my itinerary, of discussing which arrangements then promote this experimentalism. So before I do that, however, let me suggest the following general idea. So the liberals and socialists of the 19th century were each of them, they were organized in sects, the different kinds of liberals, the different kinds of socialists. Each of them proposed a formula, an institutional and ideological formula. For example, the liberals said, the classical liberals said, adopt the classical system of rights, especially property, contract rights, and you will become both rich and free. So both freedom and prosperity will be the gift of some particular institutional formula. And that was how they differed among themselves in these sectarian positions they took. Now, we have reason to be skeptical about that, to resist this dogmatism. So our problem is that we think we have to be able to change the structure, but we have to be able to develop the structure, to experiment with it as we go along. It can't be an all or nothing thing, that it's either this path or the rejection of that path. And that puts us in a very different situation from their situation, the situation of the classical liberals and socialists. So should I continue now to my, yes?
So you're talking about this sort of struggle between structuralism and experimentalism, as we imagine the kind of change.
Yes, but let me qualify what you just said, because experimentalism is not the opposite of structuralism. So unless by structuralism you mean the dogmatic view of structures, because I would understand structuralism as being an emphasis on the primacy of structural change over non-structural change. And that's not the opposite of experimentalism. Experimentalism is one way in which to assert structuralism if we define structuralism in that fashion.
Okay. Okay, that's a useful correction. I guess I'm just trying to map this, when I try to map this onto the terrain of politics that we live in now, I see another set of, another way of dividing it, which you could describe as capital versus labor, you could define as those who are invested in maintaining the power and wealth relationships of the status quo versus those who want to disrupt them. And historically looking back, I can see all these moments where one side or the other has been more effective at making small changes into larger structural transformative changes, making them stick. But usually, it's the folks who have the power and the wealth who are better at doing that. And so...
Now, say that again. Say that.
Usually, it's the folks who have the power and the wealth who are better.
Yes, that's why there's a path of least resistance.
Right, but so that creates a huge problem for those of us who want to disrupt that, because by trying to make structural change that invites experimentalism and this kind of fluidity,
Sure.
then don't we just leave ourselves more open to that being hijacked by the interests of the status quo?
Of course. So the great advantage that the defenders of the path of least resistance have is that they have on one hand the dominant interests and the established preconceptions, and on the other hand they have something that's tangible, that already works, that's already there. The insular knowledge economy doesn't have to be invented. It's what's present. It's what's tangible. The enemies of the path of least resistance also, however, have also an advantage. The advantage that the enemies of the path of least resistance have is that characteristically, the path of least resistance shortchanges the potential of the innovations. So the path of least resistance downsizes the innovation to accommodate it to the established world. But in doing that, then, it diminishes the ability to take advantage collectively of the path of least resistance. Now, how does this then become relevant in practical politics? It becomes relevant because, for example, the issue is tied up with the question of national empowerment. So there's a struggle in the elite, in a national elite, about national power, national wealth, including military power as well as economic power. And then a faction of the elite then appeals to the broader mass of the people in the name of national power, characteristically more often than in the name of some ideal of equality. And they say, we need to lift the country up. That's what happened, for example, in Japan in the Meiji Restoration in the middle of the 19th century. And that's how there then comes to be a conflict between the defenders of the path of least resistance and the enemies of the path of least resistance. The basis of the conflict is this characteristic inability of the path of least resistance to exploit the advantages of the innovation. Now, not just the advantages for the outsiders, the social outsiders, the poor, the working classes, but the advantages for national power. So there has to be a conflict in the elites, and part of the elites then has to appeal outside and in a national transformation conducted for the sake of national empowerment. Of course, the whole question of nations and national empowerment didn't figure centrally in Marxist theory. And that's another reason why this theme does not figure prominently there. But that's how I would begin to answer your objection. Any other comment or question? So let's focus on that last element in the proto-theory, which is the experimentalist bias. So one set of arrangements and assumptions, one regime differs from another in its ability to lend itself to correction. So let me first relate this to another contrast now, also outside economics, that has to do with political theory. Central idea of liberal political theory, of classical liberal political theory, is the distinction between the right and the good. There are impersonal principles of right. The particular goods or interests with which we pursue are sectarian. The aspiration of the classical liberals was to discover and establish a neutral framework of right that would be neutral among conflicting sectarian visions of the good. Now, I want to say, there is no, and there can be no neutral framework of right. Every institutional order tilts the scales of experience in favor of some forms, of some interests, of some visions of the good, and against others. It discourages some forms of experience, and it promotes others. So the claim of neutrality is always adduced in favor of its opposite. The consequence of the claim of neutrality is to entrench some order against attack from another quarter, which is then the opposite. But nevertheless, the idea of neutrality has a kinship to another idea, which is legitimate and even indispensable. The other idea is that although an institutional framework cannot be neutral, an institutional framework can differ from another one in being more open to a wide range of contradictory experience, and above all, in being corrigible. So openness to contradiction and corrigibility are, in this view, the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. So that's what we would want. We would want a system which is open to a large range of contradictions, so it generates a large range of material from which we can select. And it allows itself to be challenged and changed. It narrows the distance between those two categories of moves that I described, the structure preserving ones and the structure reforming ones, with the result that it allows us to engage in the structure to a greater extent without surrendering to it, and to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And that is freedom. That's a dimension of freedom and power, which we have reason to pursue. Now then we can ask, in these contemporary societies, the background to our programmatic discussions here in the course, what in general are the arrangements that have the greatest influence on this experimentalist tendency, that can contribute most to this experimentalist tendency? And I think there are two. They have to do with culture, with an experimentalist culture or form of consciousness, and they have to do with politics, with the organization of democratic politics and the creation of a high-energy democracy that doesn't need crisis as the condition of change. So let me say a word about each of them, because these remarks about culture and politics bear on each of the themes that we have been and will be discussing: vanguard and rearguard, labor and capital, finance and the real economy. Let's take now the example of a country like the United States, or like my country, Brazil. In countries that are large, very unequal, as these two countries are, among the most unequal in the world, and federal in structure, it is necessary to reconcile the local management of the schools by towns and municipalities with national standards of investment and quality. So the quality of the education that a young person receives must not, for example, depend on local finance, because the principle must be that the education of a young person must not depend on the happenstance of where or to whom it was born. And to reconcile national standards with investment in quality, it's necessary to have three instruments. So first, it's necessary to have a way of assessing what works or how it works, school by school and student by student. Second, it's necessary to have a redistributive mechanism to redistribute resources and staff from richer places to poorer places. And third, it's necessary to have a corrective mechanism. If a local school system persistently falls beneath the minimum acceptable threshold of quality, there has to be some way of taking it over, of fixing it, and of returning it fixed. So for example, in a federation, the three levels of the federation can join together in common bodies with this mission. They take over a local failing school system, they attribute its reform or management temporarily to independent experts, they fix it and they return it fixed, like you would fix a failing business in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the United States. But that's just the external background, because then there's the question, what is the method of teaching and learning that is appropriate to the formation of this experimentalist culture in both technical and general education? So in general education, it must be a method combining four attributes. So first, it must emphasize the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the imagination over the mastery of dead information. Now, of course, these capabilities are not acquired in a vacuum of content. They're acquired in dealing with content. But with respect to content, what matters is not encyclopedic coverage. What matters is selective depth. So the education should be thematic or project-oriented. Third, the social setting of education should be like the social setting of advanced scientific work. Namely, it should be cooperative. There should be cooperation among students, among teachers, among schools. That should be the basis, by contrast to the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism. And fourth, and this is the most significant change from the traditional prescriptions, this education should be dialectical. Everything should be taught at least twice. Nothing should be taught just once, from contrasting points of view and with contrasting methods, because that's the only way to liberate the mind. And if we renounce the ideal of encyclopedic scope coverage, then we have the time to teach in this dialectical fashion. And this idea is not just an idea of general education, it applies to technical education, because the form of technical education required then in an experimentalist culture is not like the traditional technical education with its job-specific and machine-specific skills. It focuses on higher order, flexible manual and conceptual capabilities required for the use of numerically controlled machine tools. So I think that in addition to these ideas about education and as the basis for an experimentalist culture, there's something more fundamental or philosophical, of a spiritual character, is that in these societies there's the idea that the sublime is privatized. So politics, political life, is the realm of cold equities and efficiencies, marginal gains in equity and efficiency. But everything that is hot, everything that is deep, in religion, in art, in personal pursuits, is privatized. And that, of course, is unacceptable for this experimentalism. You have to connect the personal and the political or the collective. and we have to resist the privatization of the supply. Now, the second large condition for the development of this experimentalism has to do with the organization of democratic politics. All the democracies that exist in the world are flawed, relatively weak democracies. And the manifestation of their weakness is that in them, change continues to depend on crisis. So the rule is no trauma, no transformation. And we have a dramatic example of this in the United States, which Franklin Roosevelt had as his allies the greatest war in world history and the greatest economic collapse in modern history. And even so, he had trouble because the system was designed to give him trouble. So what we want to do is to diminish the dependence of change on crisis, to overthrow the rule of the living by the dead, as Thomas Jefferson wanted, by his proposal to trash the American Constitution every 2.5 generations, and to increase the structural fecundity of democratic politics, its ability to generate, one after another, radical reforms, fragmentary changes in the structure. So what does that depend on? It depends, to my mind, chiefly on 3 sets of institutional innovations. First, innovations that increase the temperature of politics. That is to say, the level of organized popular engagement in political life. So, the premise of conservative political science and conservative statecraft is that there is an opposition, a contradiction between a politics that is cold and institutional and a politics that is hot and extra or anti-institutional. So you have to choose, as I said, I think in an earlier class, between Madison and Mussolini. And what this excludes is the idea that politics can be both hot and institutional. You can heighten the temperature of politics. And I would say only a politics which is more mobilizational, which has a higher level of organized popular engagement, can have high structural fecundity, ability to generate alternative structural programs. And what does that depend on? Well, it depends on a host of things. The rules governing the relation between money and politics, between politics and the media, for example, whether television time can be bought or not bought, or is meted out for free to the political parties and the social movements, the electoral regimes, the rules of mandatory voting, and so forth. So, for example, it's commonly said that the fact that only half of the electorate votes in the United States is a feature of national culture. But if you give me a rule of mandatory voting, as many democracies in the world, both rich and poor, have, you can dramatically increase the engagement of the people in political life. And then we can have a debate about the rights and wrongs of mandatory voting. But all mandatory voting means is that you have an obligation to vote subject to a small fine. And every country in the world that has adopted a rule of mandatory voting has never subsequently revoked it, and has acquired what began as a legal obligation ended up as a national habit. So that's all about, let's say, the temperature of politics. Then the second set of institutional innovations have to do with the pace of politics. So the general principle is do in politics what Karl Popper said we should do in science, which is make mistakes as quickly as possible. And it's the acceleration of the pace of politics. So in the American context with a tripartite state, There's a liberal principle of the fragmentation of politics, and there's a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, embodied in Madison's scheme of checks and balances. And the result is the creation of a kind of correspondence between the transformative reach of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that has to overcome in order to be implemented. But it's relatively easy to imagine many ways in which you could reaffirm the liberal principle but repudiate the conservative one. For example, you could say that in the face of a deadlock between the two political branches of government, both branches should unilaterally have a right to call early elections, which, however, would always have to be bilateral for both branches. So the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative of calling the early elections would always have to to pay the electoral price of running the political risk of the early elections. And there are many other mechanisms by which you could produce a similar effect if you wanted to. So in other words, the combination of the liberal principle with the conservative principle in the American constitutional arrangements is not by necessity, it's by intention and design. And then we come to the third domain of institutional innovation, which is the relation between the center and the periphery, or the states, the municipalities. So it should be possible in a high-energy democracy to encourage decisive initiative by the central government, but at the same time to allow some of the states or municipalities under certain conditions, vetted by politically and judicially to prevent abuse, to secede from the dominant solutions and to generate counter models of the national future, to have strong central action and radical devolution of power at the same time. And there you have an example, a concrete example of what I mean by high energy democracy. So giving substance to the notion of an experimentalist tendency in culture, in consciousness, I would say, the development of education in this dialectical experimentalist direction, and the creation of a high energy democracy that no longer needs crisis to make change possible. And that brings the idea of experimentalism down to earth and shows the practical institutional conditions on which it depends. Now there's one more step in this trajectory that I intend, the fifth step, but let me ask again, your challenges and comments, questions about this. Yes.
I understand the point and the idea, to create a more, flexible or open set of institutions. But it seems like the risk there would be that if you take away, obviously that takes away some of the power that the certain entrenched people in government or the elites today. You just replace that with another set of people who currently control the reins at a point, who then become the only conservatives at the time, and say roll back some of the high speediness or the flexibility of the institutions, because those, now that they're in power, having that rapid transformation, that rapid change is no longer in their interest. So I feel like there's a risk of you just end up replacing one.
Well, I think it's possible that there's that risk, because I think, for example, you take the example of the constitutional mechanism I suggested, calling the early elections. Many people would say the danger is that would be used too often, but I think the danger is that it would be used too rarely, precisely for the reason that you suggest. But nevertheless, it's moving in a certain direction, right? This is not all or nothing. So I'm trying to imagine then how we would give a tangible form to this idea of experimentalism, of democratic experimentalism. So it's not an idea up in the sky, but it takes an earthly form, a practical form. And these are all marginal gains. And a defender of classical liberalism would say they're dangerous because who knows what direction these experiments would take. And they are dangerous in a sense, and I think there with Alfred North Whitehead's remark applies that the business of the future is to be dangerous. So this is not a kind of perpetual motion machine that insures us against missteps, misdirections, against the political mistakes of majorities and so forth. We can create a series of safeguards, but they're all relative, to be sure. But I think that the alternative to that is to entrench some particular order and to claim that it's the neutral order. And it's not the neutral order. It's an option for a particular form of social life against others. So underneath this, there has to be an element of the democratic faith in the good sense and constructive genius of ordinary men and women to decide things, to choose things, to be educated by politics, by political experience, rather than to be under the tutelage of notables, which was the 18th century idea, that there's some people who know better and who will conduct them. But it's not this idea that there's a guarantee. There's no guarantee, but certainly the guarantee can't be in the idea of entrenching some form of social life against challenge. So it's the liquefaction of institutional arrangements that allow some entrenched scheme of social division and hierarchy to rigidify. So, and this is great significance in the world because in the rich North Atlantic societies, we have this stable system, this form of the regulated market economy, which I'm arguing throughout the course, is unable to solve or even to address any of the major structural problems of the contemporary societies. And then the only alternative to that on offer in the world seems to be authoritarian state capitalism. And that's not good enough. So the question is how we create an alternatives to those two options, which are the main options now on offer in the world. And it seems to me that this experimentalist idea should appeal to many of our aspirations. It should appeal in the United States. Yes.
I feel like there's a problem of trust that underpins this conception of an experimentalist system of structures. Because if you think about the transition from the 19th century and the movement of trust in civil society from a divine right to the Madisonian system of power
Yes.
against power, this seems to open the gate of trust again. And it doesn't seem that there's an evident answer of how you resolve the problem of trust.
Well, first of all, remember that your allusion to the concept of trust is very interesting because first let's see it in an economic context. As I have repeatedly said at different moments in the course, the knowledge economy is the most advanced form of production, and the institutional program that would be required for its dissemination and deepening imply a heightening of the level of trust. So the conventional industry and the conventional form of the market order were based on the generalization of low trust among strangers. This advanced form of production requires a heightening of the level of trust. So it's a momentous change in the moral culture of economic life. And certainly it applies also in politics. So take, for example, in my outline of a program for high energy democracy, you could ask, where should you begin? So I think in the United States, everyone agrees that the second set of innovations, the ones that have to do with the structure of government, are the last to be addressed because of the cult of the Constitution in the United States. So it's the last thing you would touch. The disposition of the American progressives seems to be to emphasize the first set of innovations having to do with the temperature of politics, money in politics, media in politics, and so forth. I think that's a mistake. I think that in the United States, the natural place to begin is the third, federalism, the re-energizing of American federalism for experimentalist purposes. But there's a problem of trust, because the idea that part of the country would be allowed to deviate from the dominant solutions resonates in American history with the whole question of states' rights and secession. So it would have to be controlled, vetted, to impede the use of this power of deviation to persecute, to promote class privilege or race privilege or persecution of any kind. And so there has to be some architecture to organize the experimentalism. So I do think you face the question of trust in every dimension. But I insist, it seems to me that this openness to experiment is the alternative then to the perpetual motion machine. Either you're entrenching a structure and saying, we won't allow this to be challenged, and we'll treat it as beyond challenge and as the embodiment of neutrality, or we will allow it to be challenged, and then we'll have to deal with these problems of the dangers of experimentalism and of trust. So that's the square that has to be the circle that has to be squared in some way. There's no way out of this other than that. What do you think?
I think earlier in the course, the evident problem to me was a vertical trust problem between labor and capital, or capital, wealth and poverty, however you want to frame that.
Yes.
The problem that I'm struggling to grapple how to solve is the horizontal trust between elites or between labor groups across dimensions of society, as opposed to vertically. It seems that that's a more intractable problem.
Give me more of an example.
So, for example, if you look at the enclaves where the knowledge economy is proliferated, like Google,
Yes.
places in Silicon Valley, there's been some creation of vertical trust between the owners of companies and the workers within the companies, and a
Well, they have common interests.
They have common interests, but there's this residual distrust between elites at the same level, for example, elites at the head of businesses or elites at the head of government or within government, that seems to be more intractable because the dimensions of power and the benefits of the knowledge economy or an experimental economy seem, the risks and the benefits are harder to square. I can't really describe it better than that, I guess.
You mean between those who are in these fringes and those who are outside of them?
So how do you, for example, if you're describing an experimentalist democracy, where you have a left and a right that you're trying to create in a more of an experimentalist cycle that is prepared to conduct revisions, how do you break a cycle across people who have arguably equally distributed power because they're all elites in a political environment, yet they entrench into one side or the other in terms of moving forward on a particular policy?
Well, I don't think you can aspire to some easy consensus. So the question, there has to be division, there has to be conflict. But the question, and it is the question that I was intending to come to next, is which are the vital conflicts? Which conflicts are the crucial ones? So all these ideas about institutions that I've been exemplifying in this up to now 4-step argument, they're the reverse side of a theory of agency, of how these institutional alternatives meet up with real forces and real interests in the world. So to me, an institutional program is always just the reverse side of some idea of coalitions. And a coalition is not just a consensus of everyone. It joins some people, but it joins them against other people. So, and it seems to me that the crucial point is this thesis, which I would take as the beginning of a theory of agency. It's a duality thesis. It says there's always more than one way of defining and defending a group interest or a class interest. There's always a way that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and another way that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. So I gave the example of the workers headquartered in conventional industry, the Rust Belt industries. And so they can say, our interest is to build into our current niche in the technical division of labor. Defend that niche by a series of delaying tactics that will buy us time. Subsidies, constraints on plant closings, on offshoring, and so forth. And then the groups that are closest to us in social and economic space, which are the temporary workers, the foreign workers, the small business class, and so forth, will be our enemies. So that's one way. But there's always another way, which is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. So then they would say, this has no future. The Rust Belt industries aren't coming back. All we can do is buy a few more years for them. If we're going to hold on, we have to convert these industries into something else. We have to make them versions of the knowledge economy. And in that project of industrial conversion, the groups that we used to think of as our enemies have to become our allies. Now, this idea of agency is the exact opposite of Marx's idea, because Marx's idea was that as class conflict broadens in scope and intensifies, the objective content of class interest becomes manifest. And the price for mistaking what your real interests are is political defeat. That was Marx's theory of agency, of interest. This is the opposite, because it's saying the impression that classes have an objective interest is to some extent an illusion, dependent on institutional stagnation. To the extent that conflict intensifies and broadens in scope, the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes inseparable from the question, who would I be under these different alternatives, the adjacent possible, the next steps? And how would I then think of my interest and identity? So it's the opposite of the question of agency. Now, for all of these alternatives that I've been beginning to discuss in the course, about vanguards and rearguards, about labor and capital, about finance and the real economy, which we're coming to in future weeks, it seems to me the crucial questions of agency are the following. There are three groups that are crucial. First, in the elites, in the national elites, the relation between the value creators, the productivists, and the rentiers. So it's necessary for the productivist interests those who have a stake in the evolution of the production system beyond conventional industry toward the knowledge economy, toward an inclusive knowledge economy. To oppose the rentiers, the rent seekers, and to wrap themselves up in the banner of national empowerment, and then to speak to a broader part of the population. So the conflict within the elites characteristically involves an appeal beyond the elites of the progressive, of the productivists. So that's the first group. Then the second group are the workers, who were the historical constituency of institutionally conservative social democracy, headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy. And they're the ones who have to think there's no future in this purely defensive attempt to buy a few more years for conventional industry. Our program, our project, has to be a project of industrial conversion. And in that project has to involve a broader set of alliances. But the alliances won't be of everyone. It will have enemies. And the enemies will, for example, be the rentiers. Now, the third group is the one that seems to me to be most interesting, looking at this from a world perspective. The third group is the small business class, the petty bourgeoisie. Because, as I've argued before, in the petty bourgeoisie, the small business class defined objectively is, of course, a minority in every country. But defined subjectively, it's the majority of humanity. The majority of humanity aspires to a modest prosperity and independence. It has a petty bourgeois horizon. And the greatest historical mistake that the left made in the 20th century was to demonize the petty bourgeoisie and its aspirations, leading it to turn into the mainstay of the right-wing movements in the 20th century. And that's a mistake that should not be repeated. So the problem is that this petty bourgeois aspiration, by default, is directed to the traditional archaic form of isolated family business. A small plot of land, a little store, a little shop, because there's no alternative. So then the task of the progressives would be to meet this petty bourgeois aspiration, not objectively petty bourgeois, but subjectively petty bourgeois, and presented with a broader range of options. And that then becomes the path to this. That's a complicated operation, of course. So I think that's where the real question of agency is today. So of these three groups that I mentioned, the conflict between the productivists and the rentiers within the elite, the traditional workers headquartered in conventional industry, and the subjective petty bourgeois, to me the most important are the first and the third. The least important are the second, which is historically the main focus of social democracy. That's what I would say. So do you understand, in countries like Brazil or India, the majority of people are poor, but their horizon is petty bourgeois. Their horizon is their default aspiration is the aspiration of the small business class. And if there's no other vehicle by which this aspiration can be achieved, then the default vehicle is traditional, regressive, isolated family business based on family saving and self-exploitation. So that's the task. And the greatest potential for movement I see in this national conflict, at the elite level, and in its combination with this attempt to meet this petty bourgeois aspiration on its own terms and give it a broader range of possible satisfactions. So that's actually the totality of the argument that I wanted to make. And today, and next week we would discuss inequality, and then finance and labor and capital. That's the plan. So what do you think? So I think the main intellectual claim that I'm making, the main claim I've made in this argument is we need a way of thinking about structure and structural discontinuity and structural change. Without a theory of regimes, social thought is blind. And we can't find a theory of regimes in economics, as this coexistence of the three tendencies I've described demonstrates. And so it's a very tall order to create one, given this material. You know, in the world now, and I said this in a different version earlier in the course. There are two main intellectual tendencies in the culture of most countries around the world. There is, on the one hand, part of the intelligentsia embraces a shrunken Marxism. So they continue to use the vocabulary of Marxist theory without believing in its heroic assumptions. That's this problem that I described. The theory has become literally incredible. And William James said people believe everything they can, and they can't believe in this. But they continue to use the vocabulary, as if they had continued to believe in the theory, which they don't. That's a source of enormous confusion. And then, so what have they done with Marxist theory? They've taken an axe from the zeitgeist. They've cut Marxism in half. They've thrown out the good part, which are the transformative aspirations, and they've kept the bad part, which is the historical fatalism, the structural determinism. So that's half of the life of the national intelligentsia in many countries around the world. The other half is the imitation of American-style social science and policy discourse, conducted in the spirit in which I described as right-wing Hegelianism, narrowing funnel of convergence to the best institutions and practices worldwide. So these two things, of course, seem to be opposite. But from another perspective, they're very similar. They're the chorus of fate, which says you can't generate alternatives. So they're both fatalistic. And this combination of these two tendencies is aggravated by what you could call mental colonialism. So even countries that are very nationalistic and have a great sense of their prerogatives in the world are importing their ideas, especially from the United States. So this is the hostile intellectual climate in which we must conduct these operations. On the other hand, in the world, there's a huge range of micro-experimentalism. There's a kind of Brownian motion coming from below. The micro-experiments are not harnessed to larger institutional projects, but they could be if there were these institutional projects. And so that's all immensely increases the potential that is there in the historical moment. But the potential has to be mobilized. And there's no way of mobilizing it without an idea. Yes.
Yes, there's something that I am missing. I don't understand what would be the incentives for the elites to satisfy or to move towards the bourgeoisie, and since basically their interests are much better served right now with the status quo.
Well, you have to look at the details of each national circumstance. So, for example, in my country, in Brazil, we have a big problem because those who fail as producers can prosper as rentiers. So, there's an astronomical real rate of interest, more than twice the highest level of anywhere else in the world. So basically, risk-free payment and financial instruments. So there's an easy escape. But if a member of an elite is ambitious as a productivist, he doesn't want to be a rentier. And then there's also the question of nationalism, nationalist commitment. So I think these transformations happen in the world when part of the national elite has its own political and economic interests, but it also thinks it wants to take its country out of mediocrity. And that's what repeatedly happened in the world. So it happened in East Asia, then before it happened in Germany, then it happened everywhere. In every country that was a relative latecomer, there was some combination of interest of some faction of the national elite with nationalism. That's what worked. That's the only thing that worked. And then that involved an appeal to some broader part of the population. So now I think the main problem we have in the world is this mass of people whose objective circumstance is poverty, but whose subjective circumstance is some vicarious participation in the consciousness of the small business class. So it seems to me that there too there's an opportunity of meeting them, of offering something to them, which can lift them up. Now, so the essence of the practical response to them is some operation of lifting them up, right? Of lift up. That would be, as I said earlier, a 21st century equivalent to the 19th century agricultural extension. You go to the small-time producer and you bring him a higher level of science, of knowledge, of capability in partnership with the state. And then you organize also among them, and you go to your issue of trust, some form of cooperative competition in which they can cooperate to achieve economies of scale while remaining independent economic agents competing with one another. So, but I'm not diminishing the difficulty of such an enterprise. It's always going to be the case that the world is organized to reproduce itself, right? So if you look at the world from outside, it seems that everything conspires against any kind of transformation because everyone has a role. The elites, as you say, have a comfortable life. Why would they endanger it? But then we couldn't understand why transformation actually happens in the world. It happens because there are conflicts within the elites, because then part of the elite, in its interest to defeat its rivals in the elite, then appeals to a larger part of the mass. And now there's this basis of this petty bourgeois revolt in the mass. So I see that as a fertile terrain for transformation, but not without enormous difficulties and risks. So there's this, we have inherited this ambitious ideological vocabulary from the 20th century, right? Which are supposedly all of these options, these different forms of liberalism, there's socialism, there's this and that. But in fact, there isn't any of this. What there is social democracy has retreated to its last line of defense, which is the preservation of a high level of social entitlements, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. It's been eviscerated, it's been liberalized, and that's what we call social liberalism. So that's one thing. And that's on offer in the North Atlantic world. And then in most of the rest of the world, what we have is some kind of authoritarian state capitalism. Those are the options. So it could continue forever if there's no war, if there's no economic collapse. But there's reason to rebel against it. And so that's the discussion. So no one has another view? Yes.
It seems to me, and this is more of a question, perhaps than a view, but that to make this change, it starts with having a progressive elite in power that is willing to make this change. How can you tell if, say, there was a progressive leadership in the U.S., or for that matter, say Lula in Brazil, is doing the initial steps to make such a change versus just playing in the
You can't tell. You can't tell because in politics, in real political life, the meaning of any initiative is determined by what comes next. So, for example, any partial reform, and I've argued today that almost all reforms are partial. Structural change almost always is fragmentary. Any fragmentary reform can be simply a way of not reforming more, or it can be the opposite. It can be a direction towards another reform. So because an institutional program is just the reverse side of a coalition, the progress of these projects, transformative projects, has to go together with the reinterpretation of class interests, of group interests, and identities. They're all part of the same thing. So every powerful transformative project in the world develops its own constituency. Its constituency is not an antecedent condition. It creates its constituency. So, for example, conventional industry, as it was established, take the South American republics, Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil. They introduced conventional industry, and then they created this organized industrial labor force, which became its constituency. It didn't exist before. It was the creation of this project. And that's what every project does. Franklin Roosevelt in the United States created his own constituency. So the development of the alliance goes together with the institutional project. Otherwise, how could anything change in the world? The roles that exist, the positions that exist in the world, are for the benefit of the world to continue being itself. And anything, any transformative project exists before its coalition, the coalition that would support it, has already been consolidated. And if we don't understand that, we can't understand how transformation ever takes place. But I think that a powerful intellectual element in this stasis, in this stagnation, is the absence of ideas about alternatives. So if it's not that the ideas all in of themselves would have transformative power, it's that without the ideas, there's no road to transformation. I mean, look at what happened to Roosevelt in the United States. He was a genuine experimentalist. And he said so, that that's what he believed in. Try one thing, try another. If it doesn't work, go on. But at the end, the early institutional experimentalism of the New Deal, really just 1933 and the first 6 months of 1934, if you look at them in retrospect, they were basically the same ideas that were on offer in the world in all the North Atlantic countries. So the government as an employer of last resort in the Works Project Administration and the regional development projects like the TVA, and corporatism, managed competition, restabilization, cartels organized by the government. Those were the ideas that are on offer. So it wasn't good enough for Franklin Roosevelt to be temperamentally a radical experimentalism. He too was at the mercy of the ideas that were available. So everyone is. And the institutional ideas on offer in the world at any given time are relatively inelastic. So the premise of the politician is the idea